welcome to the Stories of Northern Life from the Sault Ste. Marie Museum. Today, I'm letting Nicole Curry, the collections assistant here at the Sault Museum, take over and share with you a topic she truly finds fascinating. I hope you feel her enthusiasm in uncovering these stories and learn a little something new about Sault Ste. Marie history. More specifically, the history of funerals.
Funeral homes are a fairly new invention. Funerals had historically been held in the family's home. In the more recent style and wealthier homes, funerals were held in the parlor, which was a room in the front of the house where guests would be hosted. These were fancier rooms that showed off the family's wealth. These rooms have been around since about the Renaissance, so 1500s to about the early 1900s. Therefore, it was a natural choice to host the funerals and visitations in this room, away from the rooms where the guests were not permitted unless they were family or close friends. Fun tidbit. Funeral homes, sometimes in England, were actually called funeral parlors. And this was because they wanted to give off the sense that they were another welcoming place, like the family parlors that you had in the home. So switching over would maybe be a little bit more of an easier thing. So invite people almost into your home to host a funeral. So not much pressure or demands was put on you. So that was sort of just an interesting little piece of how, I guess, more British terms are trying to keep the term funeral parlors to have that link still to the family home. Before funeral homes, there were funeral stores, but these are more furniture stores. They would make and sell caskets, coffins, and other things needed for funerals. So it was just a natural choice to sort of have them mingled in with a furniture store. So listed in the city directories, you can see people having furniture stores, and then you would look under undertakers or funeral directors or whatever, and some of those same names would be listed there as well. So if you were an undertaker or a funeral director in the early times, you would have probably also had a furniture store so that you can make and sell those caskets for the funerals that you directed. Another fun tidbit is that caskets have hinged lids and coffins had lids that remove completely. So now you know the difference between the two. And I don't know when you might want to throw that little bit of knowledge out, but there you have it. Funeral directors is more of a Canadian term. Morticians is more of an American terminology, and undertakers is used more in the UK. And undertakers, it sort of got the name from those who undertook a funeral. So the funeral undertaking. So funeral undertaker, just undertaker. And that's sort of how that name came about. These were all people that would go into the family home to help out, as they didn't have that funeral home where people would come to them and help out. Mr. Kitely from Arthur Funeral Home in Barton Kitely Chapel donated a portable embalming kit. This is so fascinating. And they brought these kits with them so that they could perform the embalming at the family home. So I got to look through it and look at all the old tools. But they would do things like this so that they would make the death process as easy as possible for the family, and to make them more comfortable, they wanted to keep them in their own family home. So, funeral homes or furniture stores were around in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Funeral homes, where they hosted the funerals in their buildings, were found more so in larger urban centers. And the switch was sort of gradual as they branched out with casket making to transporting the deceased to the cemetery to hosting the funerals themselves. So this switch was a little bit easier in the larger urban centers. However, in places more rural, like the Sioux, especially the Sioux in the early 1900s, we were a little bit slower on that upkeep, so we see funeral homes appearing a little bit later. Another interesting tidbit is that graveyards refer to a cemetery that is attached to a church, and a cemetery is land that is specifically used as a burial ground. Funeral directors have always been taking care of the dead and helping to prepare them for burial. They also help the families with the funeral and the whole process of death. They do more than what we know in helping the families through their most difficult times. Now, let's look at the Sioux. I received the history of funeral services, the Arthur Funeral Home, and the Barton and Kitely Funeral Home from Arthur Funeral Home, Barton Kitely Chapel. So thank you to them for helping me with all of this, helping give me the history, and also participating in an interview. So you will hear that episode next week as I interview Mr. Kitely. The history of funeral services was written by Bob Elliott, a former funeral director from Arthur Funeral Home, and he gave this information in about 2004. The first funeral director in the Sioux was Edward Bassingthwaighte, who did not have a funeral home but operated his business on Pym Street. And now that is what it says in Bob Elliott's letter. However, doing more research and looking through the city directories, I found a little bit different information. So we're not exactly sure when Bassingthwaighte started, though our city directories go back to 1901, or at least the ones that we have here do, and it lists him as a furniture dealer on Queen Street. He is also listed as an undertaker, as are Sevier Marshlandon and Simpson and Gully, both of whom were also furniture dealers. In 1902, Simpson and Gully separated and operated their own furniture stores. However, that same year, Mr. Bassingthwaighte, who was on Queen Street next to the registry office, and T.E. Simpson, who was at the corner of Queen and Elgin, were listed as the undertakers. T.E. Simpson was also a conservative MPP for several years. In 1907, funeral directors was finally listed in the directory. However, only J.T. O'Neill was named. In that same year, Bassingthwaighte, Simpson, and O'Neill, who was on the Jubilee block, were all listed as undertakers. In 1908, O'Neill is gone, and there is no other listing for funeral directors. He also seemed to have been replaced by M.J. Mahone as a furniture dealer and an undertaker, as he was also in the Jubilee block. So I'm not sure if Mahone took over and changed the name, or if he just happened to also own or open up a furniture store and be an undertaker in the Jubilee block. F.C. Pern also became an undertaker in 1908. In 1909, Pern is no longer listed as an undertaker, so he was there and gone. From then until 1919, it remained the three when Bassingthwaighte was no longer listed. After that, it remained only Mahone and Simpson as the undertakers. In 1925, Mahone was also listed as a funeral director, and the following year he was joined by Simpson. In 1929, Undertaker was removed from the directory, and there was only a listing for funeral directors. The term Undertaker was removed from the directory, and there was only a listing for funeral directors. Mahone took most of the Catholic funerals, and Simpson looked after most of the Protestant funerals. There was reportedly no funeral home in the Sioux until 1937, according to the letter from Bob Elliott, and I couldn't find any listed in the directory either. The Vernon's directory never listed any funeral homes. It wasn't until the Bell telephone book that we see the term funeral home being used for the Sioux. In 1938, Mahone was no longer listed as a funeral director in the city directory. He was replaced by the First and Arthur Funeral Home on Wellington Street. In 1940, still listed under funeral directors, is Arthur Funeral Home and T.E. Simpson Funeral Home. In 1940, still listed under funeral directors, is Arthur Funeral Home and T.E. Simpson Funeral Home. In 1944, Mahone is listed once again. In 1947, the Barton Funeral Home is added. In 1950, Mahone's moved to Bay Street and Simpson's name changed to the Langstaff Funeral Home. In 1951-52, Mahone's was gone and seemed to be replaced by O'Sullivan's Funeral Home on St. James. The letter written by Bob Elliott explains more of what was going on at the time, so we can compare that to what we see in the directories. The letter says that the Simpson Funeral Home was started by T.E. Simpson in 1939. He built a new funeral home behind his furniture store on Elgin Street. The furniture store is where Fabricland is now, and the funeral home is actually still standing. Georgie Swarmas occupies it now. Simpson built the funeral home to look like the Morley Bedford Funeral Home in Toronto, but reversed. He also bought a new Cadillac hearse at the time. Fun tidbit. Did you know that hearses aren't actually produced? They are converted from other vehicles. Therefore, you can have any vehicle converted into a hearse, not just the standard Cadillac. You can have Hummers, Teslas, I think even minivans. Pretty much any vehicle can sort of be taken in by another company to convert it into a hearse. Pretty neat. James, or Jim Warren Arthur, moved up from London where he worked in a funeral home. He and his uncle John First opened the First and Arthur Funeral Home on Wellington Street in 1937. They had a slow start, but they added an ambulance service that helped boost business. Arthur joined the RCAF, the Royal Canadian Air Force, when war broke out, and Merton Williamson ran the business for him while he was away. During this time, his uncle passed away, so the business name was changed to Arthur Funeral Home. Norman Langstaff was hired on, and in 1945, when Arthur returned, Langstaff left and bought out Simpson and changed the name to the Langstaff Funeral Home. Dennis O'Sullivan apprenticed at Arthur's, and when he got his license, he opened up his own funeral home in 1950 and catered to Catholic services. Now, at this time, Arthur was actually trying to increase his Catholic business by adding a Catholic chapel to host more of those Catholic ceremonies. But with O'Sullivan's opening up and taking that Catholic business, that whole dream sort of died out. Now, when Norman Langstaff's health began to fail, perhaps around the 60s or 70s, it's not exactly clear, he sold his business to Brian Harris. And again, I'm not really sure when this was. I only know that the business failed shortly after. In the West End, Ron Caricato opened a funeral home for a few years, I think around the 80s. There were a few other funeral homes in operation over the years. They would come and go. However, the main ones were the Arthur Funeral Home, the Simpson Funeral Home, Barton Funeral Home, O'Sullivan Funeral Home. Then you had the Langstaff Funeral Home, Barton and Kitely Funeral Home, and now, just as of the, I think 1990, around there, about 1991, we have Northwood Funeral Home. I spoke with William Kitely, who worked for Leonard Barton. You will hear this interview in the next episode. I got to learn a lot about Barton and Kitely Funeral Home. Here's some information that will give you a bit of background. Leonard Barton was born on St. Joseph Island. He started working for Mr. Chesterton, a licensed funeral director operating out of his home on the island. In 1935, he apprenticed with T.E. Simpson. Barton's brother Tom obtained a license, and they bought out Chesterton's business. In 1937, Leonard went on to obtain his embalmer's certificate. When war broke out in World War II, he enlisted and was placed in the medical department. Tom took care of the business while he was overseas. When Leonard returned, he immediately began to look for a suitable location for his business. He and his wife traveled around to other cities like Southern Ontario and learned that it was best to set up business near churches. Services were still held at the church, not necessarily in the funeral home. He therefore purchased a property at 165 Brock Street, right across St. Luke's, and sort of next to a whole bunch of other churches sort of around in the other blocks. He opened the doors to Barton Funeral Home on September 21st, 1946. The business on the island eventually blended into the one in the Soo, so all the islanders would go to Barton's Funeral Home. In 1964, William Kitely joined the firm. He attended the Canadian School of Embalming in Toronto. He apprenticed at Dreisinger's Funeral Home in Elmira and the Butler Funeral Home in Islington. When Barton retired in 1972, Kitely purchased the business and changed the name to Barton and Kitely Funeral Home. In 1975, Arthur sold the business to Chuck McLeod. In 1983, Bill Kitely and Bob Linklater jointly purchased Arthur Funeral Home and formed a new company called Rossou Investments. They kept the businesses separate, so Arthur Funeral Home and Barton and Kitely Funeral Home, with Bob looking after Arthur's and Kitely looking after Barton and Kitely's. However, a few years later, in 1989, the Lewian Group purchased the company and thus both funeral homes. Linklater moved to BC, where they were headquarters, to work with them, and Kitely ran both businesses. At that time, it became the Sault Ste. Marie Funeral Ltd., and Kitely was made president. In 2017, the Barton and Kitely Funeral Home was closed and merged officially with Arthur's, and the name was changed to the Arthur Funeral Home and Barton and Kitely Chapel. So there is your history on the funeral homes in Sault Ste. Marie. That gives you a bit of information of how they developed, of how Arthur Funeral Home is one of the longest running funeral homes in Sault Ste. Marie, actually the longest running funeral home, and still with some of the original people around. O'Sullivan's did change hands a bunch. It was sold to a few different people, so the original family isn't there anymore, but O'Sullivan still has been around for a really long time. And then we have the new addition of the Northwood Funeral Home. And another really interesting thing and really important thing I feel is that Arthur Funeral Home really does try to cater to the Francophone community. A lot of their early ads that were in the phone book were actually listed in French. It actually listed it as a funeral home for Francophones. The ad or notice was listed in French. So as sort of a francophone, I guess you can say, that's very important. It shows that they wanted to sort of cater to all of the Sioux, and they weren't just looking at the Anglophone community. They were looking at another one of our large communities that often get overlooked. But that's still just my personal bias. So thank you for listening. I hope you found it interesting. I know this might not be everyone's cup of tea, but I love all this stuff. I find it very fascinating. And in the interview you hear next week, you'll also hear how important funeral directors are and sort of a little bit more of their personal take, why they do what they do. So I hope you will also tune in to hear that. So thank you. Don't forget to give us a follow the podcast, follow us on our socials at Sioux Museum, and yeah, have a good day.